everyone, welcome to the October 6th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and we are really in the midst of Breeders' Cup prep season. We had some stakes last week at Aqueduct. Keeneland starts this week, and that's what's going to be the focus of this podcast. We also have been discussing Santa Anita on this podcast. We did that on the forecast last week. More stakes there this week. So really interested to see how all of these Breeders' Cup preps shake out over the next few weeks, and those Breeders' Cup fields start to take place. And I think some of the races we're going to discuss on this podcast will give us a lot of clarity towards that end. As I said, Keeneland will be the focus for us on the forecast this week. We'll be discussing their Saturday pick 5 there. It is an all-stakes pick 5 sequence that begins in race 6, running through the 10th race, beginning with the Woodford for the Turf Sprinters, the Thoroughbred Club of America for the filly and mare Dirt Sprinters, then the First Lady on the turf, Breeders' Futurity for the 2-year-olds, and then closing things out with the Coolmore Turf Mile. That a grade 1 event, as are 2 others in this sequence, the last 3 legs, all grade 1s. And Craig, there's a lot of star power in these races that can lead to some shorter priced favorites that may or may not be beatable, but we're going to talk about it from both sides as we go through these races, handicapping them. And this does feel like a very approachable pick 5 sequence.
Yeah, that's I was going to use the word manageable, but very similar in these in that we have pretty big fields, but I don't think there's a lot of depth. They're going to need to find some prices in a few of the legs because I think there are a few legs where we're probably not going to find a price. Not necessarily the favorite, but I don't think you have to go too deep. So interesting sequence that I think you can try to get through with a reasonable ticket.
Yeah, a couple of those grade 1 races on the turf later do feature the leaders of their respective divisions, so we'll see if they're able to solidify their status heading into the Breeders' Cup. And the other grade 1, the Breeders' Futurity, arguably features the future leader of that division. We'll see how that all plays out. But the first 2 legs maybe a little more wide open, so we'll start to talk about that as we begin handicapping the sprint races that kick off the late pick 5. And let's dive right in with race 6. It is the grade 2 Woodford. This one going the 5.5 furlong distance on the turf at Keeneland. Craig, I'll say I was looking at the forecast. It seems like Lexington, Kentucky is going to be a little luckier in terms of weather than where I'm currently located in the New York City metropolitan area. Unfortunately, another week of rain for Aqueduct. Well, we're not discussing Aqueduct on the forecast this week, but it did seem like there was the possibility of maybe some rain for Keeneland this weekend, but the forecast has sort of brightened up and it looks like it's going to be sunny, so I would imagine there'll be a firm turf course on Saturday, so we'll kind of go in with that baseline set. And Craig, interesting race, this Woodford, because the horse that's pegged as the morning line favorite is the number 2, Live in the Dream, and he's a horse that's coming in from Europe, and I think rightly so. A lot of handicappers regard these European sprinters with a little bit of skepticism as they come in to face their U.S. counterparts, who just generally possess more early speed and speed in general. However, Live in the Dream is a different sort of European horse than we typically see coming over because he has a ton of gate speed, is a front runner who typically has no trouble getting to the lead in his European races, and I think the connections have targeted an American campaign at the end of the season for him because they believe he's so well suited to American racing, and watching his races, I kind of get why they've come to that conclusion.
Yeah, he's fast, no doubt about it. I mean, his replays are available on YouTube, and like you said, he's not your typical European sprinter. I'm still a little bit skeptical at a short price personally. His last race kind of came out of nowhere, and when you read the comments, it sounds like the Timeform commentary is a little bit skeptical as well, saying he would need things to go his own way. And I'm not sure. It's just hard to know how fast he is when we talk about in terms of American speed because they generally just don't go as fast in Europe.
They don't. What I will say about Live in the Dream is that he is excellent at the gate. I mean, I know that European gate speed can be a different thing than American gate speed, but if you watch any number of this horse's starts, he always breaks first, and often it's not even close. I mean, this horse just has that gate break timed perfectly. He's very well trained in that respect, or he just has that ability naturally. So he is able to get that advantage early, and there is other speed in here. So I think if they have intentions to go forward, they're going to have to set what feels like it's going to be a pretty honest pace, but I'm not too worried about him breaking slowly, which I think is the chief concern with a lot of these European horses that typically show speed in Europe when they come to the US. It's the gait that's an issue, not necessarily having the natural speed, but getting out of the gate and getting that forward position in American racing can be a difficult thing for them. I'm not so worried about this horse. Just watching his races, he always gives you confidence that he's going to break sharply. What happens in the final furlong can be a different issue, and whether he stacks up against this field and is good enough, I think that's the bigger concern with Living the Dream. And like you said, he's got that huge time form rating last time for that great Group 1 Nunthorpe victory. He beat one of the top European sprinters out there in Highfield Princess that day and just basically ran that field off its feet. When you watch the replay of that race on YouTube, there's a very heartwarming interview with his trainer afterwards who kind of couldn't believe that he actually won the race. He said he just sort of entered him to get a piece, and he was saying that, they were kind of going back and forth between running in the Nunthorpe, taking a shot, and starting his American campaign earlier. They're actually, I think, targeting that Green Flash at Del Mar, thinking that they'd get in a 5-furlong race in California because their long-term goal is the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. And the owners basically said, this horse hasn't proven it to us yet. We're not paying to go to America. So I guess that would have the Nunthorpe paid the bills to make this trip. He's a cool horse. He's an easy story to root for in this race. It just feels like, even though I respect the talent that he showed last time and his professionalism from the gate, these just feel like the kind of horses you're supposed to take a shot against, Craig. I mean, there are a lot of things working in his favor that make you say you have more confidence in him than a typical European runner in this situation. But it feels like a lot of people are going to see those things, and the short price, the 3-1 morning line, I think seems fairly accurate. At that kind of price, I think there's enough talent elsewhere in this field that I want to go shopping for some better value.
And that's exactly where I was going. If he wins, I won't be shocked, but he's not the kind of horse I want to start a pick five with at a short price. So I'm going to definitely look in some other directions. And I guess I'll start with the horse right to his inside. Bad Beat Brian is one of those that I'm considering. He's run well at Keeneland before. He gets a good inside post. He's pretty quick. We mentioned that there's other speed in this race. I want to be pretty clear. None of them are really confirmed need to lead front runners. So I won't be surprised if Living the Dream is on the front end. I just worry if he can actually finish it off. And one of the ones I think is going to be in close attendance and is in good form and just really fits well in this field is Bad Beat Brian.
Yeah, he seems like a logical horse. He's been a little bit of an overachiever in his career. He nearly upset Caravel over the same course and distance earlier in the season in the Shaker Town when I think we had both mentioned him a little bit on the forecast that day, Craig, and he almost got there at 40-1. Since then, his form has been okay. He won a weaker optional claiming race at Churchill, got some time off during the summer, came back for 2 races in Kentucky this fall or summer into fall, and he was part of that blanket finish in that lucrative turf sprint last time at Kentucky Downs. He was the one setting the pace that day, and the race kind of fell apart at the end. So you could maybe upgrade him a little bit because he was the one that kind of helped force that race to fall apart in the later stages. Turning back to 5.5 furlongs as opposed to 6 is supposed to be a little better for him. He's drawn well, so I agree. I think he makes sense in here. He's not going to be as big a price as he's been on some other occasions, but I think he's perfectly logical in this spot. Crick, what do you make of some of the horses towards the outside that I do think are going to take money in here, like the number 8, Our Shot, who is coming out of another blanket finish in the Harvey Pack Stakes at Saratoga, where he was just barely beaten by Big Invasion, one of the best turf sprinters out there, as well as the long shot Thin White Duke, and also Beer Can Man on the outside, who feels like he's always in the conversation in these races, and he does win his fair share. It feels like he's come back as a 5-year-old off yet another long layoff, but he's been in pretty good form this year. So, I mean, they seem like logical contenders, though. They're the kinds of horses that I wouldn't want to take too short a price on. 9-2 and 4-1 feels a little light for me on both of them.
Yeah, of the two, I prefer Beer Can Man. I just think he's more suited to this. Our Shot, I didn't really like his race. We talked about that on one of our race previews, the Harvey Pack, and he's a horse who wasn't really on the inside like the pace setter that day. He he was right there at the finish. I don't want to knock him too hard. It just seems like he's a cut below these to me. His speed figures are all in the mid one teens, so I'm not as high on him. Whereas Beer Can Man has run some faster races. He has traveled before. He did it at Pimlico, winning, beating Nothing Better, who's a pretty decent turf sprinter. So he's the one I prefer of those two. And as the speed figure maker, I have to talk a little bit about the filly in here, Coffee Maker, who ran a 120 TimeformUS speed figure winning an allowance. She may be the main danger to press Living the Dream on the front end, as she is the one most likely to lead. She is able to rate though, so I wouldn't be surprised if she's getting a good trip sitting in second just off of Living the Dream. And of all the others we mentioned, she would probably be my second choice and will probably offer much more value, though I'm not sure she's going to be 12 to 1 being a Wesley Ward trainee with Luis Saez riding.
Yeah, there are a couple of Wesley Ward trainees in here that are both big prices on the morning line, and I think they're both worth talking about. I'll bring up the other one in just a second, but first I'll comment on Coffee Maker. Craig, she's a horse that's sort of tough for me to gauge in this race because she's sort of had so many stops and starts in her career. She hasn't even run in a stakes race since the 2021 Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint, and that was just 4 starts back in her past performances, or 5 starts back in her past performances. I mean, she's sort of had trouble staying at the top level because of layoffs and maybe some lackluster performances along the way. She was visually impressive last time, winning that optional claimer at Saratoga against her own gender. I'm not sure that I would be, I'd want anybody else that finished behind her that day in future starts. Just didn't think a whole lot of that field. They did better, like they knew she was going to win that day. I mean, she was coming in off some, not necessarily dominant speed figures, but she still took a ton of money, got to the front end, and just was able to spurt away from that field late. I don't know, none of the fractions are color-coded in blue, but I mean, that felt, watching it, like a real merry-go-round race. Nobody really changed position. This is going to be a very different sort of pace scenario for her. I do think she can come from off the pace. She did it certainly during her 2-year-old season, but like I said, it's just been so long since she's gotten a real class test, so I don't know what to make of her, and I do think, like you said, she could drift down a little bit off that 12 to 1 line. And I'll just comment, nice to see Luis Saez retain the mount on her. I know he missed some time, but good to see him coming back and getting some mounts on this Keeneland Saturday card. The other Wesley Ward trainee, the number 4, Eyewitness, I think is pretty interesting in here. He's a 3-year-old stepping up against older horses, but I think his last couple races are maybe even a little better than they look on paper. The speed figures are respectable enough. He's going to have to improve, but I mean, that Paradise Creek that he won 2 back, that was a race that featured an extremely fast pace over a turf course that was rated yielding. It was, I think, the only turf race they ran on the course that day, just really producing slow final finishing times. And he was contesting that early pace, sitting just in behind the leaders. A lot of the horses that were right up on the pace completely fell apart, lost by giant margins, and he actually had a right to get tired at the end after forging to the lead in mid-stretch. I thought that was a good effort for a horse that maybe has pushed past his limit, going 7 furlongs anyway, and then they cut him back to 5.5 last time with the Mahoney, and I think there's an argument he should have won that race. He missed the start a little bit, was a little further back than I think they wanted him in the early stages. Jose Ortiz gave him a pretty good ride, but rode him very conservatively to upper stretch and just sort of trying to wait to find a seam to run, and it seemed like he had finally found a path in deep stretch, but sort of got shut off in the final 16th of a mile. That probably cost him second, might have actually cost him the victory that day. And the runner-up, Private Creed, came back to run a big race next time at Kentucky Downs. So I think the form of that race is just fine, and he feels like the kind of up-and-coming 3-year-old that might be ready to take a step forward against a field where I'm not necessarily convinced that any of these older horses are necessarily so formidable.
Yeah, I like him as well. He's definitely going to be on my tickets. If it's not pretty obvious by now, this is a race that I'm going to spread pretty wide in because I think some of the other legs we can go shorter, but it seems like a wide open race. And you make a good point with the trouble he had last time. It looks like if you just didn't do a deep dive into his past performances, he isn't really improving his speed figures. But if you consider the trouble last time, he took another step forward, and he's just a 3-year-old, so I suspect he has another one in him, and he's probably going to be the biggest price of all the horses we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, he ran a 111 all the way back in March of his 3-year-old season. So, I mean, I know he had a layoff after that, but just with natural improvement, I think this horse is sitting on a step forward in a race like this. And I'm got some confidence that Wesley Ward is taking a shot here. Craig, there are some others that we can bring up. I mean, if you do think the race is going to fall apart, I guess a horse like the number 6 Olympic Runner is maybe, the best closer of the group. Even though he's got that victory at 5.5 furlongs, 2 back at Colonial, that came against a softer field. I wonder if he's really at his best going 5.5. I mean, I suppose you could make some of the same points about Arzak, though I think he's a little bit of a last time was the time horse when he won at 17-1 at Saratoga. So, I mean, I get cases for horses like that. They just weren't necessarily for me in this race.
No, I agree. These races don't generally completely fall apart. I mean, once in a blue moon it'll happen, but there would have to be a whole lot of faster horses that are really staggering in the lane for horses like Olympic Runner or Arzak to come flying late. So I'm going to stick with the ones that at least have shown some tactical speed.
Let's move on to the next leg of this sequence, sticking with the sprinters, but moving over to the dirt in the Thoroughbred Club of America. This one, a grade 2 event for the fillies and mares. 6 furlongs is the distance. Craig, only a field of 7, and I would say one of those, the outside horse, Be Like Water, probably a little tough to make. But as far as the other 6 go that are entered in here, I mean, pretty competitive. Just a month or two ago, I think a horse like the number 1, Wicked Halo, would have been a heavy favorite in this race, probably odds on, but you have to start to question her current form. She had to work a little harder than expected to win that Twin Bridges Stakes at Ellis Park 2 back as the 1-5 favorite. Then she went down to defeat at a similar price last time at Churchill Downs with just an unusually dull effort for a horse that had previously been so consistent. So I think the big question around this race is, can Wicked Halo bounce back? Because if you think Wicked Halo is going to put another dull effort in, then this race becomes very wide open.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like that race was that long ago. It was, I guess it'll be about 3 weeks by the time she runs. She's had a workout in between, and it didn't really give any clues as she went 4 furlongs in over 52 seconds. So I think there's some real question marks for her, and drawing the rails not necessarily a great spot in this one-turn race. And she's one of the favorites that I'm actually pretty interested in trying to beat in here.
Yeah, I think she's the second choice on the morning line. I'll be interested to see who goes favored in this race. For me, it would be a toss-up between her and Ugiri, who did beat her last time, and I think she's the kind of first place that you have to go, Craig, if you're looking to beat a horse like Wicked Halo. Ugiri, she was visually impressive winning that Open Mind. I think that race became a lot easier for her to win once Wicked Halo just, put forth a performance that was a shadow of her former form. So, I mean, when you kind of take her out of the equation, I think it makes the victory by Ugiri a little bit less impressive. I guess the big thing with Ugiri, Craig, is that she's a 6-furlong dirt sprinter. That's what she wants to do. They've tried a number of things recently that have, most of them haven't worked out. Turf, synthetic, longer distances. Sprinting on the dirt, especially at 6 furlongs, is her gig. I'm just not sure that she's that good. I mean, she's never run a particularly formidable speed figure. She's got good early speed, but I think she could get a little bit overbet off that victory last time that I wasn't blown away by.
No, I prefer her, I guess, to Wicked Halo. Like you mentioned, she is 5 for 5 going 6 furlongs on the dirt, but the speed figures are a problem for me. And when you look back, her 2 best speed figures came on off tracks, which she's likely not going to get on Saturday. When she ran in the mid 1 teens, it was on a muddy track and a sloppy track at Oaklawn. So, yeah, I'm not very high on her either. And I guess I'll jump in with the horse that I do like on top, and that's Happy Soul for Wesley Ward. She's one of those horses that, for some reason, has kind of been pegged as a turf horse, even though she has yet to win on that surface. And I actually really like her dirt races. Hopefully, her form hasn't been dulled too much, but it just seems like one that really has her form dirtied up by running on a surface that I just don't think she cares for all that much. I mean, she was blowing horses away on dirt. She tried 2 turns, which seemed a little foolish, and it seemed to set her back for a little while. But if she's in any kind of decent form, I think she's really dangerous in here.
Yeah, she's an interesting horse in here. If she's 8-1 like she is in the morning line, I'm not going to knock her, Craig. I mean, that's a fair price on a horse like this. I guess my big issue with Happy Soul is that she, to me, just feels like a horse that never developed. I mean, she was one of those 2-year-olds that looked more physically daunting than her competition. She had a lot of size to her when she was a young horse, and she just bossed around competition in a few races. Actually, she won 3 in a row by large margins, from May of her 2-year-old season to very early February in her 3-year-old season, and she hasn't won since then. She's lost since that 3-race winning streak. And when you look at her speed figures, I mean, she ran a 111 in February, or actually a 112 in that February victory, and since then, she has barely bettered that number, and now she's at the end of her 4-year-old season. And I get it, she might be a little more of a dirt horse, even though she's run fine on the turf. Like you said, she hasn't won, and it certainly doesn't feel like she's necessarily moved up on the turf. I mean, if anything, she's as good on the turf. So I don't mind the experiment of going back to the dirt. Wesley Ward has good turf-to-dirt stats. If you look them up in Formulator, they're putting blinkers on, which I think says that they're trying to get back to more of the aggressive tactics that worked for her as a 2-year-old. I just wonder if she's one of those horses that hasn't gone on developing. But maybe she doesn't have to put forth a much better effort to beat this field, because if Wicked Halo doesn't show up, and if Ugiri is a little overbet or dressed up off that victory last time, a 112 TimeformUS speed figure might win this race.
Yeah, and that's where I was leaning, and it's just one of a few I'm going to use. And the other one is kind of a similar horse in that although she's won on turf a few times, the 4-horse Static Fire, she's done nothing wrong in her 2 dirt races. She's won them both fairly easily. She has good tactical speed, and she's another who I think she's just a lately raced 4-year-old, has only shown up one time, won a race at Kentucky Downs, but I have no doubt that she can cut back the dirt. As a matter of fact, I'm even more confident that she'll handle the dirt well than Happy Soul will at this time. I say handle it well, I mean back to the form that we have seen her in, just because she looks like she's in top form, and I think she is very dangerous in here too.
Yeah, she's the one that I'm leaning a little bit more towards, between these two horses switching surfaces from turf back to dirt. I've never quite understood why Static Fire's connections, Brian Lynch, or maybe it's an ownership thing, have been so committed to running her on the turf. I know she won her debut on the turf, but I mean, I still think the best race she ran in her career was that second start where she beat a very good filly and on the 1s and 2s on the dirt at Churchill Downs coming off a long layoff. That was really impressive, and it sort of just boggled my mind that they went back to turf after that. And I mean, she's run okay, but she's only won one of her 4 turf starts since then, and that was the last one when she came off the layoff at Kentucky Downs. And I will say I didn't like her other dirt races much when she ran over the Keeneland course in October last year. That was just a much weaker field. Actually, it's kind of funny when you watch that race. The best horse that was in there is actually Roses for Deborah. I think that was the last time she ran on the dirt, and she's since become a turf and synthetic monster. But Static Fire beat a field of dirt horses that just wasn't very good that day. I did like her last race a lot at Kentucky Downs. That was a race that featured pace. I mean, she was cutting out the fractions, and she put away every horse that challenged her. Happy Soul was one of them, took a shot at her early. She flicked her away. Closers were coming at her late. She never let them get into the race. She found multiple gears to kick on again. That career best performance, it did come on the turf, but just given the way she's transitioned to dirt in the past, I think maybe that improved form is going to carry over, and I think she's the most interesting horse in this race. And, I was speaking about Wesley Ward having good stats. Brian Lynch, turf to dirt sprints over the past 5 years, he's 10 for 34. That's a 29% win rate with a $3.70 ROI. So, I think Static Fire is pretty appealing in here. She's kind of the one that I was keying in on in this race, but it is wide open, Craig. I don't want to live or die with Static Fire, because you do have to keep an open mind with regard to price in a few of these races, because I think that, I get the sense both of us might be leaning a little chalky later. I haven't talked to you about it yet, but I'm just kind of feeling like that's the way a lot of those races go in the latter part of this sequence. So I'm going to use your horse, Happy Soul, because she's going to be the right kind of price. Maybe if I'm keying on Static Fire, but, I want to keep an open mind with regard to both of those horses. I tried to make Fire on Time or Last Leaf. I had a little more trouble with those two. Fire on Time, I thought really had no excuse last time behind Ugiri. Last Leaf feels like on occasion can pop up with a big speed figure, but she's a little unreliable. She is cross-entered in a stakes at Gulfstream Park, I believe the Princess Rooney on Saturday, so I'm not even sure if she's running here, but just wanted to give them a mention because they're the kinds of horses, if they're big prices, if you see in the double when you're playing the first leg, that they're not taking any money, maybe you want to throw them in as backups, but I kind of was leaning towards 4 and 5 here. And Craig, before we move on from this race, I just want to touch upon Wicked Halo because you gave your take on her, and I kind of agree with it, but I didn't really give my take on Wicked Halo. Steve Asmussen, it's been this weird phenomenon over the past few years where it feels like at the end of the summer, his horses just really struggle in Kentucky. I feel like it's like 3 years in a row now, Craig, that we've seen this phenomenon where the fall meet at Churchill and the fall meet at Keeneland, the Steve Asmussen barn just goes really cold. I don't know what the issue is with that. Maybe the barn really gears up for Saratoga and, they fire a lot of bullets. I don't know what goes on, but even looking it up in Formulator over the past 2 months in Kentucky, his ROI is currently sitting below $1. And the form of a horse like Wicked Halo, you kind of see it there with the way she fell apart last time. I guess if you're going to take an optimistic view of Wicked Halo, you'll say that her 2 best races in her career, arguably, came at Keeneland last year when she won the Raven Run and then was a very good third in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint, a race that arguably she could have been second or maybe even won with a better trip that day. It's hard to take horses like her off inexplicable poor efforts when they previously had been so consistent.
Yeah, as I said, I agree with you. Even her win 2 back was pretty poor in my eyes. I mean, she was coming off of that good second, the Good Night Olive, and just even though she won, it was not a very strong field. So I think we're both pretty against her. And those are some interesting stats about Steve Asmussen, something I hadn't considered.
Move on to the next leg of this sequence. Race 8 is the First Lady as we head into the Grade 1 portion of this card. This one going a mile on the turf for the fillies and mares. And it's the rematch, Craig, of the Diana from earlier in the summer when White Beam upset in Italian that day. And now they face off again, and it's sort of, reminiscent of last year when In Italian was the upsetter in the Diana and then came back in the First Lady and tried to solidify her status as the up-and-comer in the division against Rico Glory, who was considered the leader at that point, and she was able to do it again, winning her second Grade 1 in a row. We'll see if White Beam is able to pull it off here. I mean, she obviously ran down In Italian fair and square last time. I didn't think there was anything fluky about that victory. Flavien Prat, I thought, gave White Beam a very good ride to apply some subtle pressure to In Italian at earlier stages of the race than maybe other jockeys would have, sort of pressing the button around the 3/8 pole to make In Italian work a little bit earlier. And I think going the mile and eighth distance, that makes In Italian vulnerable because anything beyond a mile and a 16th, I think, is pushing In Italian past her stamina limits just a little bit, and it was able to work out for them last time. We'll see if it works out again, but there's no denying that just based on her overall body of work, In Italian is way the horse to beat in this race.
I agree. I mean, I think you could go through the PPs and try to make a case for several horses in this field, but in the end, it just came down to the 2 horses that are the lowest on the morning line, In Italian and White Beam. And I'm with you. I don't think there was anything fluky about White Beam's win last time. She just was a hair better than In Italian. But I think the distance is going to prove key in here. It's just going to be a lot tougher to run her down. Particularly, there's just not a lot of speed in here. The horse we have shown second in the pace projector, sixth, the name is okay, has shown some speed in the past, but when she's on the lead, they're all races with blue fractions and, much lower level of competition. So I don't think she's any serious challenge. And though I would use White Beam as a backup in here, In Italian is going to where most of my play is going to go through.
Yeah, I agree with that about the pace of this race because I think you do have to discuss it. The 6, the name is okay. I mean, she does have some speed, and I guess if Joe Rocco really wants to go on a mission, he could apply some pressure in Italian, but I'm not viewing that as a likely scenario. I don't think an Italian's going to be allowed to walk on the lead and go 48 or 49, but I think even if they go a mid-47 fraction over a firm turf course, that's going to be pretty beneficial to an Italian. I mean, I guess the other horse that you could say has the potential to apply some pressure is the number 8, Evie Jets, but she was successful coming from off the pace last time. She's also being ridden by Jose Ortiz, who does get a lot of mounts for Chad Brown, and Irad is on Joel's on in Italian. Irad's not riding here on Keeneland on Saturday, but it just feels like, given who's riding Evie Jets, I don't think it's likely that she's going to be the one applying pressure to the Chad Brown horse. So I think an Italian's going to get the right kind of pace setup. The big question with her is just, is that Diana evidence that maybe she's taken a slight step backwards? Because these horses that get really good, I think sometimes we take it for granted that they're just going to maintain that form right up until the end of their careers, and it doesn't always work out that way. These horses often have a limited window in which they peak. And she's been at her peak for a very long time now, basically over a year. And are we going to see her just start to come apart a little bit? And is that Diana maybe evidence of that? And I think if you're going to try to use White Beam again, that's the case that you're making. That Diana was some evidence that maybe in Italian isn't quite as sharp as she was at the start of this year, at the very end of last year. And White Beam obviously is a horse that is really progressive. We didn't see the best of her in her U.S. debut, but since then, she's been taking big steps forward with each start. That Gallarette was really impressive. I mean, that's one of the reasons I liked her in the Diana, that she showed such a push button turn of foot in that Gallarette, and I like the versatility that she displayed in that Diana, sitting so up close to the pace. She drew a great post position. She should be able to get the right kind of pocket trip here, and I think White Beam is usable again. If they're 3-1 and 4-5, I think I'd give the slight edge to White Beam. If they're more like 6-5 and 5-2, I would probably want to use them in equal strength. Obviously, we're not going to see the tote board prior to putting together a pick 5 play, but I think it's still worth talking about value and your expectations of what you're going to get on these horses. I do think an Italian's going to be a pretty short price in here, because I think a lot of people are going to assume that turning back and, that last victory being last loss being a little fluky, that, she's just going to assert her dominance once again. But I do think White Beam can beat her again, and I think White Beam is going to be a fair enough price to at least use them in equal strength.
I can definitely see that argument. She's done very little wrong. I'm glad you mentioned her last race, where it's not like we were talking about an Italian's going to be on the front end. It's not like White Beam doesn't have any speed. That was a pretty quick pace in the Diana, and she was right up there with it. So I've got no issue with her. I just think maybe the advantage. I don't think an Italian's regress personally, because looking at the speed figures, she just tailed off a couple points last time. It's a race where the speed figures held up well, and I'm attributing it to the distance. But I do think we both agree, if anybody's going to beat her, it's White Beam. Is there anyone else you wanted to make a case in here for? Because, like I said in the beginning, I thought there were some you could probably try, but I think they're all like one level below the other two.
Yeah, you know that I've been a fan of Gina Romantica in the past. This feels like it's a tough spot for her. She did draw very well, and she did achieve her lone Grade 1 victory at Keeneland last year, but that came against a softer field of 3-year-olds in the QE2, and she hasn't had ideal trips. Well, I guess she didn't have an ideal trip in the Eatontown, being a little close to the pace. I thought her Beverly D trouble line, if you could even call it that, was a little overblown. She just kind of altered course at a point in the race when she was beaten. I've just wanted to see more from her so far in her 4-year-old campaign, and she just feels like she'd need a really big step forward to beat those two Chad Brown stablemates. The one horse that I think is interesting at a price in here, Craig, probably not to win, but if you're playing exotics within this race, like exactas and trifectas, she's the horse that I'd want to use second and third, is the number 5 Gams Mission, because I know she doesn't have the speed figures in the 120s like the top two do, but she's a horse that does have real ability. We saw it during her 3-year-old season. Obviously had trouble putting together much of a campaign as a 4-year-old, but she's come back this year at 5, and I think she's run deceptively well in her last couple of races. There wasn't a whole lot of pace on in that matchmaker, and she got too far back early, but was really finishing at the end behind Consumer Spending, who I would have been interested in if she were running in this race. I don't know where she is, but she's a horse that I think could take that next step forward, but she's not playing here. And then last time in that Boston Spa, obviously Consumer Spending is the one that had the most trouble, but Gams Mission, I didn't love the ride that day with the way the pace played out. I get what Tyler Gaffalione was thinking, that I've there's not a whole lot of pace on paper, so I want to hustle her out and get her ahead of the other closers. But then it turned into a situation where a long shot ran off to challenge technical analysis on the lead, and Gam's Mission found herself in a position leading the second pack behind two runoff horses, and that's just an unfamiliar position for a horse that is typically a one-run closer. And Tyler Gaffalione put her in a position where she had to make the first move of all of the late runners, and then once she finally struck the front in the stretch, he dropped the whip, and he couldn't even really ask her for extra on the final eighth of a mile. So I think that she's a little better than her two races so far this season might indicate. She would just need a bigger step forward than I'm projecting to beat the top two, but I am going to play some exactas, White Beam and an Italian over Gam's Mission and Gam's Mission underneath them in the trifecta, and maybe even use her as a C in the pick five, on some deep tickets, because I do think she's going to be an overlay. She's going to be a bigger price than she should be in this race.
Yeah, I can see that point, and it's interesting you mentioned her because I prefer her to the other two horses coming out of that Boston spot. Jumbly, who has shipped back to Europe and come back, and Evie Jets, who actually won that race. But as opposed to Gam's Mission, I think both of those two got about as good a trips as they could have asked for, and still didn't run speed figures that would really be competitive with the two favorites in here. So if I was going to use one, and I'm a vertical player, Gam's Mission would be the horse I'd be looking for at a price.
Let's move on to the ninth race, another grade one. This is the Breeders' Futurity. 2-year-olds going a mile and a 16th on the dirt course at Keeneland. Craig, we're expecting the number 2 Timberlake to scratch and run in the Champagne instead on Saturday. Also, our colleague Dave Grenning tweeted about that Brad Cox is planning to run Timberlake there instead. I think also the filly that he entered in the Alcibiades on Friday, Emery, is expected to run in the Frisette in New York. So just something to consider about those Brad Cox runners that are entered in 2 spots. So with that mentioned, Craig, the 2 horses that are going to take most of the money in this race are the number 9 Locked and the number 3 Awesome Road, the other Brad Cox trainee. And I personally find it kind of tough to get past these horses, especially Locked, who I was really impressed with, as a lot of people were, both when he ran his debut race at Saratoga, coming from far back after a tough start to get up for third in a race where nobody else was making up that kind of ground, and then especially last time out, that mile race, where he showed much better gate speed, was forward early. Jose Ortiz rode him with so much confidence to make a move at the half-mile pole to go clear of that field, and then he easily traveled to the quarter pole and then kicked on again in the late stages to run a sub-24 final quarter, going a mile at Saratoga. I know the track was relatively quick that day, but still, that's a serious finish for a 2-year-old. This horse feels like he's really good, and I expect him to win this race, frankly. I mean, Awesome Road is the biggest challenger, but I think Locked is going to be really tough to beat.
I do as well. I wish I could try to get clever in here. When we did our race preview for the Champagne, I brought up a Todd Pletcher stat where he doesn't really do very well with horses moving out of maiden races as 2-year-olds into these grade ones. I think it was 1 for 11 or 1 for 12, and even the one winner wasn't very impressive. But in this case, I'm throwing that stat out the window because I just liked everything I saw from Locked. I guess you could argue that maybe the post position could be an issue at Keeneland, going to 2 turns. It's not a long run, so I'd have no argument with anybody that wanted to say that. But for the most part, I just want to have most of my play going through this horse. I just think he's really good, and he's going to be very tough to beat. He's already, it was obviously just 1.5 turns, but he's gone farther than most of the others in here, certainly further than his main competition, Awesome Road, assuming Timberlake is scratching, who's only gone 6 furlongs. So I just think he is way the horse to beat, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of money trying to use others.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I don't even mind the outside post that much. I mean, it'll be post 8 when Timberlake expectedly scratches. And, the way he was able to get forward last time and show that versatility, they're probably going to just try to keep him out in the clear, not worry about a 3-wide trip. And I think that's the right kind of plan on a horse like this. I mean, I'd be more worried if he sort of got stuck inside behind kickback like he did on debut. But if this horse is able to find his stride and get into a rhythm, I don't think he's losing on Saturday. Awesome Road, though, Craig, he's a horse that does have a lot of promise for Brad Cox. I mean, he won his debut quite nicely, beat a horse that came back to win in Stronghold, albeit with, I think, a slightly, maybe the same speed figure or a slightly slower speed figure. I know we talked about it on the Pacecast last week. This horse, just watching his debut, felt like one that is going to want to go longer. He certainly bred along those lines. By Quality Road, the Dam Orate, I believe, is a full sister to Pulpit, that Bluegrass winner who's turned into a really nice sire from the late 90s, early 2000s. And this horse, he ran like a lot of Brad Cox horses on debut, where he just wasn't fully clued in. He was part of a duel early with 3 other horses, sort of got clear of a couple of them, was dueling with Stronghold. It seemed like that horse was actually going better than him at the top of the stretch, but like a lot of Brad Cox horses, just under pressure, found another gear, went clear, and then the most impressive part of the race for me was the gallop out, because he went about 10 lengths clear of the runner-up after the wire. So feels like one that's going to want to go longer. I just don't know if I think he has the natural ability at this point that Locked has already shown.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to totally dismiss him. He is a horse, when you look up Brad Cox's stats, similar to Todd Pletcher's, they're actually decent. They're not like going to generate a profit, but he wins a lot more often with horses moving into top stakes races off a maiden win as 2-year-olds. His ROI is much better, so I don't want to totally eliminate the horse, but it's just Locked looks so good, and the speed figure he ran kind of matched it. Uh, the way he finished off the race, it's just so much going for him. The couple small negatives, the post, I like what you brought up, that given the way his first race went, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world to just have him out in the clear and let him get rolling and go by these horses. So I don't want to spend too much time touting a horse who's probably going to be 4 to 5, but I just think he's that good. And outside of Awesome Road, I just really couldn't make a case for anybody else, as they all have a lot of work to do.
I mean, there are other horses in this race that I like as horses. I just don't know if I love them in this spot. Like the number 1, the Wine Steward, who I thought ran really well to get the better of El Grandeo last time at Saratoga. He stumbled at the start, was really wide on the turn, and still was able to get there. It's just a big stretch out from 6 furlongs all the way to a mile and a 16th. He is by Vino Rosso, so you might think that at a distance could work for him, but watching him run, I'm not totally convinced that he's a dirt router, so just given questions and the fact that he'd have to really improve from a speed figure standpoint, he's a little tough for me to endorse in this race. Horses like West Saratoga, Generous Tipper, Northern Flame, they've all won routing before, which I think is a feather in each of their caps, but they just have to get faster to usurp horses like Locked or even Awesome Road. The slightly interesting horse to me, Craig, at a bigger price is the number 7, Just Steel. And when I was going through handicapping this race, I was trying to make a case for him because obviously, I mean, he beat Locked when he broke his maiden in a race where Locked had significant trouble. But I mean, he showed ability that day, and then he was involved in that tough pace situation last time at the Hopeful that just totally fell apart. I don't know that I love him stretching out, and I wonder if it's asking a lot, coming back after running so much at Saratoga for a trainer that does like to run his horses a lot. Sometimes it catches up to them, but there's ability in there somewhere. I just couldn't quite get there with Just Steel. But I mean, if there was one price I was going to make a little bit of a case for, or perhaps use underneath, it would be him.
And I wouldn't be surprised. We have him shown third on the pace projector, a pretty big gap behind Awesome Road. Timberlake's still on there, shown in second. So if you ignore him, he's the horse most likely to be giving pressure to Awesome Road on the front end. And based on how fast he ran early in the Hopeful, now he drew the rail that day, so he didn't have a lot of choice, but he has some real speed. And if Joel Rosario is intent on making the lead, he's going to be hard to deny, and that could cause some problems from Awesome Road to his inside.
Let's move on to the last leg of this Pick 5 sequence, wrapping up the Grade 1 action. It is the Coolmore Turf Mile, race 10. Again, going the same mile distance as the First Lady on the grass, this one for the older males. And Craig, interesting race here that I think is going to go a long way towards deciding turf championship honors for the Eclipse Awards later in the season, because I think this race is going to start things going on one of two paths for a couple of horses that could be vying for a championship. And, it's an interesting spot for Up to the Mark to return from a layoff. And, through the midpoint of the season, it seemed like a foregone conclusion that he would be the turf champion and probably wrap it up before the Breeders' Cup. But that was before he had a minor setback over the summer. Todd Pletcher has never disclosed what the injury was or what the issue was. He's been pretty tight-lipped about it, but clearly something went wrong with this horse. For him to miss some planned starts, I think they wanted to run in the Arlington Million. They had intentions of eventually pointing him to the Breeders' Cup turf, eventually, gradually stretching him out in distance. And clearly they had to abandon those plans because you don't want to get him ready for a 1.5-mile race off, one prep if you can just, squeeze it in before the Breeders' Cup. And that's what they're trying to do here, get a prep in for the Breeders' Cup. I'm not sure what to do with him in this race because I respect his natural talent so much. I mean, you watch those last two races and his stride just eats up the ground on the turf. I mean, it looks like he's moving in slow motion in some of these races as he quickly runs past these horses, and he's just won so easily. That said, when you go back and look at those fields in the Turf Classic and the Manhattan, it's not necessarily the cream of the crop. And I think he's facing a tougher field here, really a much tougher field, as he returns, going a distance that might be a little bit on the short side for him. And just to elaborate on it, last time in the Manhattan, I mean, yeah, that was a really impressive race. He got a huge speed figure. But when you look through everybody else in that field, not a single horse has won out of that race. Not just in their next start, but at any point since then in June. So I think it's a little bit of an indictment of that field, and he does have some things to prove now coming off this layoff after having this mysterious ailment.
Yeah, and you also have to wonder how fully cranked up he's going to be when this is clearly not the ultimate goal. I would assume he's a horse who could still win Male Turf Horse of the Year if he wins a Breeders' Cup race, no matter what he does in this race, given the credentials he has. So I'm a little bit against him in this spot, and a lot of it has to do with the horse who is the morning line favorite in Master of the Seas. I mean, he's a horse who came over and just crushed the Woodbine Mile, and he got a little bit of a pace upgrade for his speed figure that day, but I think it's completely warranted. There was very little pace in that race. All of the fractions are coded in blue, and it just didn't matter to him. And it's not like he's a horse who came over light on form in Europe. He was a legitimate group stakes type horse, running well in Group 1s, winning some Group 2s. So I think Master of the Seas is the real deal, and I'm not sure that a fully cranked in form up to the mark would be able to handle him. So I'm leaning really heavily on him. I know he's the morning line favorite, and that's why I spread in some of the earlier races. I just think he is that good.
Some interesting jockey assignments in this race, Craig, that I know some people make a lot of jockey decisions. You and I probably don't make quite as much of them as others do. But I think there are things that we should discuss in this race. I mean, number one, just to mention Master of the Seas, do you find it at all interesting that William Buick is at Aqueduct on Saturday riding Rebel's Romance as opposed to at Keeneland riding Master of the Seas, who seems like, I don't know, maybe a more talented horse. I mean, I guess Rebel's Romance is last year's Breeders' Cup Turf winner, but it's just interesting that the regular rider of both horses and the top rider in the Charlie Appleby rankings, is on that one, whereas James Doyle is the kind of main backup rider, is filling in Master of the Seas. Just something to consider. And also, Irad Ortiz, who loves to ride Breeders' Cup winners, loves to ride champions, is also at Aqueduct on Saturday instead of keeping the mount on Up to the Mark, who he has been on for almost his entire career and definitely through all of his turf races. Jose is substituting, obviously, for Irad and Up to the Mark. Just interesting. I mean, Irad's main mount, I guess, on Saturday at Aqueduct is Fierceness in the Champagne. We've got some others in stakes races, but Fierceness would be the shortest price of those in the major stakes. Just, I think things that you could make something of or consider because they're somewhat surprising.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I totally get William Buick, particularly when things didn't go well for Rebels Romance in his stateside debut this year when he was clipped heels and the rider fell off. And, William Buick, maybe he sees he's the Breeders' Cup Turf winner. So I try not to read too much into them. I would read a little more into Irad not coming for Up to the Mark, given what we've discussed. But then again, you have to look at it. Fierceness could be one of those horses where you just don't want to not, give up a mount on him. And who knows what happens if somebody else rode him and he wins by 10. And so I could see that being a ride he doesn't want to miss because that could have Kentucky Derby implications. So I don't go too deep into those things. As for the others, I didn't really see a whole lot else in here that interested in me. The third choice, or the third choice is Set Piece, who comes out of winning the Arlington Million. To me, that's a completely phony grade one. I'm not buying that at all. I've always considered him more of a grade two, even grade three type horse. So he's not for me. And Annapolis has run some good races, but he just hasn't seemed to be the same horse this year. His one win came in a listed stakes. He hasn't had any success trying to beat Casa Creed. And the last race, when he ran at Kentucky Downs, had to be a disappointment, not even coming close at even money. So for me, it just came down to the top two, and I much prefer Master of the Seas.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder a little bit if I'm falling into a trap because I kind of agree with you with Master of the Seas because it feels like he might have been cranked up for a big effort last time at Woodbine, and this is just like a stepping stone race to get him to the Breeders' Cup, like they did with Modern Games last year, where they just took a shot next time in that Queen Elizabeth at Ascot in between winning the Woodbine Mile and the Breeders' Cup Mile. So, I wonder if this is going to be a little bit of a dip in the form for Master of the Seas before he goes up again for the Breeders' Cup. But gosh, he was so impressive last time in that Woodbine Mile. And I know these Godolphin Appleby horses sometimes run their best races at Woodbine. I don't know what it is about that venue, but we seem to see some otherworldly performances from them there. But I mean, he walloped Cheryl Spite by nearly 4 lengths. And remember, Cheryl Spite was second in the Breeders' Cup Mile last year. He's a pretty good horse and feels like he might have been rounding back into form. And Master of the Seas just never gave him a chance. And he won that race without William Buick even having to take the stick out. I mean, just all hands and heels to the wire, inhaling that field and finishing it up strongly. He is a one-run closer, so, I mean, I think you do have to worry about the pace a little bit with a horse like him. The same goes for Up to the Mark, but Up to the Mark feels like he maybe even is a little more handy than Master of the Seas, who takes a little longer to get going. I still think he's the most likely winner of this race, and he's the one that I want to lean on because it's not just that Woodbine Mile. He was so impressive in his prior start, that Group 2 Summer Mile, and I thought he had some legitimate excuses going back to last winter in Dubai when it seems like his form tailed off. He had a no-chance trip in the Dubai Turf and really should have won that Group 1 prior to that in March. So, I mean, when you start to take apart his form, he's maybe even better than he looks on paper. I'm going to lean on Master of the Seas here, Craig, but I do kind of have that nagging idea in the back of my mind that maybe this is a race where you're supposed to even be looking a little deeper. I just couldn't figure out where else to go in here because, I mean, you brought up the other horses that could take money. I mean, Set Piece, I thought last time was the time to have him in the Arlington Million when, like you said, that was a weaker grade one. And also, he had a huge pace setup to close into, the perfect situation for him. He's never been quite as effective going a mile, so or at Keeneland per se. So, I mean, that he's not a horse for me in this race. And Annapolis, yes, he did have trouble last time at Kentucky Downs. He was trying to make a run between horses, got sawed off, and was cost at least a couple of lengths at the wire. That said, I mean, he had gotten a very good trip up until that point, and he sort of had a chance to go through that hole if he had possessed the acceleration that we saw out of him when he won the Turf Mile last year, him being the defending champion in this race. And it's just, he hasn't looked like the same horse so far in 2023. He should have beaten Casa Creed 2 back in the 4-star Dave when he got the jump on him. It just feels like maybe Annapolis hasn't gone on since his 3-year-old season, so he's not for me. I was even sort of going as far as taking another look at a Tone who, was part of that fast pace that fell apart in the Arlington Million. And then, last time out, maybe he didn't get an aggressive enough ride in that Mint Millions. But I mean, where are his races that make him better than horses like Up to the Mark and Master of the Seas? So, the further I looked, I just was, kind of going through horses that I didn't think had the natural ability to win a race like this. So it kind of does come down to the two favorites. And like you, I prefer Master of the Seas.
Now, do you make anything of Annapolis being entered by Todd Pletcher in the same race Up to the Marks in, or just there's not a lot of spots to run in?
I mean, there really aren't. What are the other big preps for the Breeders' Cup Mile? I guess if they're pointing for that race that they'd run in, there is no longer one in New York. I guess they could have shipped out to California to run in. Was it the race last week that Hong Kong Harry won? But I mean, Todd doesn't do that much. I mean, he was running a couple 2-year-olds in California this weekend, but that seems like more of a Mike Rapoli initiative. So no, I don't make too much of it, Craig. This has become the race that you run in to prep for the Breeders' Cup Mile. I think that's just the way the racing calendar has worked out these days. So it feels like we covered the handicapping of this sequence. It's time to go back and recap a little bit. I don't think it's going to take that long, Craig, because we agree a lot, unsurprisingly. But it does feel like the kind of ticket that you can put together and you can lean on some strong opinions and have it be pretty affordable.
Yeah, I'm going to spread pretty wide in that first leg. I'll have to see. We will get a chance to see the odds and how heavy Living the Dream's going to get bet. It's not like I don't think he can win. I just think he's going to be over bet. So I'll wait and see on the odds before deciding on him. But I do want to use horses like Bad Beat Brian, Eyewitness, who you brought up, the other Wesley Ward, Coffee Maker, Beer Can Man generally shows up and runs, and maybe even a couple others in here because it's a race where I just want to get through it because I'm pretty short in some of the other legs, so it's one I will spend a little more time on, but those are the main prices. In the seventh, I really don't like Wicked Halo in this spot. I'm not as negative as I got you maybe are on Ugiri, but I don't love her either, but of the two, she would be on my tickets. I'm going to lean mostly on the 4 and the 5, two horses who have been running a lot on turf, but I think are pretty good. And I think if the Wicked Halo that we've seen the last couple races shows up, it's not the strongest dirt field we're ever going to see. So I'm going to lean on Happy Soul and Ugiri. In the First Lady, to me, it just comes down to the two favorites, White Beam and an Italian. I think an Italian has a pace edge. I think the distance suits her a little more. So she would be an A for me, where White Beam would be a B. And that's probably it for me. I did agree with you, Gam's Mission. I would use her more in verticals, but I would have a hard time seeing her win this race. The Breeders' Futurity, almost all of my play is going to go through Locked. He would be an A. Awesome Road would be a C type, and that would be about it for me. And then in the last leg, it's mostly going to be Master of Seas of the Seas for me. I'm a little skeptical of Up to the Mark, but if I'm still alive by this point, I would want to use him. Master of the Seas would be an A, maybe Up to the Mark, and even his stablemate Annapolis, because the more I thought about it, I always say what happens at Kentucky Downs stays at Kentucky Downs, and he did have trouble. If you ignore that race, he does kind of fit here, and I don't want to leave a horse out who might get overlooked based on not winning since his debut this season. So those two would be more C's for me, but I still think Master of the Seas is going to be very difficult to beat.
Yeah, we agree a lot here. I'll just kind of give out some structure that I was jotting down. In the Woodford, Eyewitness would be kind of my top pick horse. He's an A for me, despite the big price on the line. That actually makes me want to use him more as an A in this race. But I would use the number 2, Living the Dream, in maybe equal strength here, because I think he's one of the more likely winners of this race. I'm a little skeptical of what price he's going to be. He's not a horse I'd want to lean on by any means, because I will spread in the B and C slots of this sequence, but he's not a horse I want to let beat me in this leg, because I do like his chances here. Let's just put it that way. The other horses I would use sort of as Bs are Bad Beat Brian, the 1, the 9 Coffee Maker, and the 11 Beer Can Man. And maybe on a C ticket backups, I would use horses like Arzak and Our Shot, but I'm a little less enthused about them. In the 7th race, I'm again going to spread here a little bit. Craig and I talked about the 2 horses that we both wanted to key on. The 4, Static Fire for me, and the 5, Happy Soul. I think Craig made a good case for her, and I would probably upgrade her a little bit after going through our handicapping discussion. But I would use as backups a little Wicked Halo, and I also want to use a little bit of Last Leaf if she runs here, and Ugiri. I don't like those horses per se, the 1, 3, and 6. But I don't have high confidence in this race in general. So if I'm right in the other legs, and if I get Eyewitness home in the first leg, I don't want to lose it because I took a stand in a race where I didn't, necessarily have a strong opinion. So, if I get Eyewitness, I'll want to be alive to all 5 of those horses into this TCA. in the First Lady, I'm kind of leaning towards either using White Beam and Italian in equal strength or leaning a little bit on White Beam, just given the expected price differential between these two, because I do think there might be a little bit of opposing trajectories with these horses, and I think White Beam again is going to be the significantly bigger price. I'm still deciding how I'm going to break that one up, but there'll definitely be either two A's or an A and a B, and then maybe I'll throw in Gam's Mission as a C, but she's more of a horse for vertical wagers. In the Breeders' Futurity, it's pretty simple. I agree with Craig. Locked is the A, and I use Awesome Road as a B or a C. I kind of have to decide about that, but I do think Locked is a very likely winner of that race. And then kind of a similar situation in the Turf Mile to close it out. Master of the Seas is the only A. I'd probably use Up to the Mark as a B or a C, just respecting his overall talent. I'm not quite as positive about Annapolis as Craig is, but I guess I could use him as a C in this leg, just given the fact that I've gone thinly towards the end of the sequence. But, I want to get some prices in earlier because I do want most of my play going through the locked Master of the Seas late double, which just isn't particularly clever.
Yeah, it's a fun sequence, and I'm really looking forward to this Saturday. We did a forecast last week, and we kind of lamented that the Breeders' Cup prep races weren't really what they've been in the past, but I think that changes a little this week as we have really good racing at Aqueduct, we have the racing at Keeneland, and even some really good races at Santa Anita, and I think we're going to get a lot of horses that we see run this weekend show up at Santa Anita a month from now.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a lot to talk about on the Pacecast next week, Craig. So we'll get our waters and coffees ready for that one, because it sounds like there's going to be a long list of stakes races to recap that morning. Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the forecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening to this forecast. Make sure to catch us recapping all of the stakes action from this weekend on the TimeformUS Pacecast coming up next week.